Good? Okay, so the final exam is on Schoology. Make sure you bring your iPad and it's fully charged. Bring your backup charger, whatever. So you have to do it on Schoology. That's not an option. So make sure you have it ready to go. In terms of the test, there's basically 3 chunks to the test. So for those of you that are watching this video, there's going to be 3 videos. We're going to do a review style that fits with each chunk, basically. One of the chunks of the test is matching, and it's in groups of 10. And I would say percentage-wise, about 40% of the test is that chunk. About 40% of the test is a chunk where it's multiple choice, and it gives you a scenario or a statistic or something that doesn't really, it's not just the definition of something, right? It's something more than the definition. The matching section, which is about 40% of the test, is just terms, and you have to identify what the definition is. And that's in a group of 10, exactly like what was on the unit test, right? And all of those terms will come from the terms that are in the app, like at the end of the chapter or at the end of the tab or whatever you call it digitally, right? So all of the matching terms that are in that section come directly from those. Sometimes I reword the definitions a little bit from what it is in the app, but they'll be worded close. So sometimes I word them a little different just for brevity, so it's not like super long or just to clarify it or whatever. So that's one chunk. Again, that's about 40% of the test. The other 40% is multiple choice, and it is basically a scenario or a statistic or something like that where it asks you, Susie is doing this because Johnny thought this. This is an example of what thing in sociology, right? And then the last 20% of the test, roughly, it's got the 4 main theories we've talked about all year: functionalism, conflict, SI, and exchange. It gives you a quote, a statistic, a song lyric, a historical quote, a line from a movie, something like that, and then you have to identify which of the theories matches the most with that quote, okay? So that's test format. So for this review video, there's going to be 3 parts. The first video, we're basically just going to go through the definitions, all right? So, and as I said that, I noticed that I wasn't in the right spot. So give me a second to get to the right spot and then we'll get started. I'm just going to talk a little bit as we do this. So for the definitions, obviously you have to understand the difference between micro and macro. Again, I don't know if that's directly in the matching section or whatever, but let's start with that, okay? What's the difference between micro sociology and macro sociology? Anybody?
Micro is like a close examination of individuals, and macro is like a society as a whole.
Individuals are small groups, yep. And then macro is bigger structures. So macro, in short, is top down, whereas micro is bottom up. Good. Okay, which 2 theories are macro? Which 2 main theories? There's others, but
Conflict and functionalism.
conflict and functionalism are macro, and which ones are micro?
SI and exchange.
SI and exchange, correct. So, starting with chapter 1 again. Chapter 1 is sociology, and that has to do with, I'm just going to use the book because that's a little easier. So that's an intro to sociology. It talks a lot about a variety of different things in there. Like I said, micro and macro. It talks about the different theories. So remember, you've got the 4 main theories. Functionalism and conflict are both macro theories. SI and exchange are micro theories. Functionalism, again, is a framework for building theory which tries to look and understand about how social structures relate to each other and interact with each other to perform a specific purpose or a function in society. So it views like the family, education, government, law enforcement, medicine. Those are all social institutions that exist to do something for society, right? Social conflict theory, or the conflict approach, believes that social institutions exist, but they're manipulated and controlled by groups of people that want to maintain their position of power. So those are both micro-level perspectives. There are sub-ideas related to them. So for example, what's the difference between a manifest and a latent function?
Manifest is purposeful, latent is not.
So it's the consequence.
Yes.
It's the consequence of a social action, basically. If it's the intended consequence, it's a manifest function. If it's the unintended consequence, it's a latent function. So one of the groups talked about like homelessness today in their presentation. Another group talked about alcoholism. When you look at like single parent households, in those instances they have a lot higher rates of homelessness. So there are like programs that if you're married, it's harder to qualify for, right? So if you got like a father and a mother that live together and they have kids, but they're not married, if they get married, it makes it harder for them to qualify for certain government programs, right? So that provides the unintended consequence, I should say, of having it that way is that it drives marriage rates down, right? Which is not the intention of the law. The intention in that instance would be manifest, right? What's the term for something that messes up the operation of society? Not a manifest, not a latent function, but what type of function?
Messes up what?
Messes up the operation of society. It's a social what? Social dysfunction, right? It's a dysfunction. Okay, and then with the micro level theories, you've got SI theory, and then you have exchange theory. Both of those look at small groups of people. In SI theory, it's all about perception and the social construction of reality. So what really builds society is how people interpret things. And then in exchange theory, what builds society is individuals weighing out the pros and cons of their choices, and then using those weighing out of the pros and cons to make decisions that benefit themselves. Okay, the other part of chapter 1 was about social research. So what's the difference between correlation and causation? Remember, I've said a number of times correlation does not equal causation, right?
Correlation is like a relationship between two things, and causation is like one thing makes another thing happen.
Yeah, so just because two variables change at the same time does not mean that one causes the other one, right? How about, what is the term for, if you do a study and you get the same results over and over again, that study is what? You get approximately the same results over and over again. Reliable, yep. And if you are measuring what you claim to measure, it is? What's the other term that gets mentioned with reliability frequently? Yep, go ahead, say it. Valid or validity, yep. So let me give you an example. Let's say I wanted to see, I always use the same example. I want to see how much the average person at West Fargo High School could lift for weights, okay? So I go to the weight room and then like today I go to the weight room, next week I go to the weight room, week after that I go to the weight room, I do that over and over again. That measure would be reliable because I would get approximately the same results all the time, right? But would that be valid? It would not be valid because remember back to my question, I wanted to know what the average student at West Fargo High School could lift. If I'm only going to the weight room, do I have the same sample? Does my sample represent the average student at West Fargo High School? No, because I'm only testing the people that are lifters or that are in the weight room, right? So that skews my results and it would lead to problems. It'd be like me going, let's say I wanted to figure out how much the average person in Fargo enjoyed football. So I'm like, I'll go to the Bison game and poll people, right? Average person in Fargo. Those results would not be valid because everybody that's there is there to watch football at some measure, right? Or they're there with their friends, or so the average person at the Bison game is going to value football a lot more than the average person in Fargo. But again, if I went to a Bison game, I did that each game all year, those results would be fairly reliable, they'd be fairly consistent, but they wouldn't be valid, okay? In chapter 1, we also talked about different types to do research, which fit with some of the main perspectives. You have what's called scientific or positivist sociology. That basically just seeks to describe what's happening, and that aligns more with the functionalist perspective. Then you have critical sociology, which not only seeks to try to understand what's happening, but also tries to change things. Which theory does that fit most with?
Conflict.
Conflict theory, very good. And then you have interpretive sociology, which again is another way to do research, and that would fit mostly with what? SI theory, because it's all about trying to figure out how people interpret their society. Okay, so let's move on to chapter 2 again, just discussing some of the kind of concepts in chapter 2. Again, you can look through the list with all the terms. Chapter 2 was all about culture. What are the 5 elements of culture again? What are the 5 elements of culture, and then let's define each of them. I'll give you the first one. The first one's norms, okay? Values. Beliefs. S and L are the first 2 letters for the last 2. Language and symbols. Yep. So the 5 elements of culture identified in our text are norms, values, beliefs, language, and symbols. I suppose we should define culture first though, right? So, because that's a term that'll be discussed in there. What is culture? What is culture?
Something common to a group of people?
That's correct, but you need more. So culture is the ways of life of people in a given society. So it's the way of life, way of thinking, the way of acting, the beliefs, things they value. So now let's break down the elements of culture again. What are norms?
Rules and expectations that a society guides.
Yeah, norms are the standards of behavior that a society has. Like it's how you should act, how you should, not just behavior, how you should behave, how you should think, what you should look like what's considered normal for a society. Norms define that. So we talked about a couple of different terms related to norms, or basically types of norms. There's 2 main ones, and then there's a sub one of them also. So what are the terms used to describe types of norms?
Folkways.
Folkway is one. Moray is another one. Good. And then taboo is a type of moray, basically. So can you define what's a taboo? Let's start with that. Something is taboo if it's what?
Is that like the strongest?
Yeah, if it's considered so bad that people don't even want to talk about it, that's taboo. Okay, how about a moray? Mores are the strongest norms, basically. Yep.
I thought taboo was.
Well, taboo is like an example of a moray. So the definition of a taboo would be an example of a moray that is so strong that there is norms around it that you shouldn't even discuss it, right? It's considered taboo. So if some guy came, again, this is just an example, but if some guy came to school and was like, hey, do you know who I think's cute now? My sister, right? People would be like, ew, right?